We know Mr. Magoo, and we know Hanna-Barbera, a whole animation movement that was started by animators that went on strike against Disney in the post-war era. Today on Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Dan Bashara from DePaul University joins me in examining animation as a means of communication and animation as part of a larger modernist culture. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Dan Bashara, to discuss animation as a means of communication and animation as part of a larger modernist culture. Dr. Bashara has his Ph.D. in Communication and Media from Northwestern's Screen Cultures program, and he currently teaches at DePaul and has a book coming out, Cartoon Vision, UPA, Precisionism, and American Modernism. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Let's start with animation as a means of communication and maybe give us some background to when it became a primary entertainment form in the United States.
As in general or in terms of?
Sure, because we want to talk about UPA and we want to get there, but I mean, obviously they were doing animation before that.
Oh,
we
for
mostly
sure.
think of Disney, but...
Well, before Disney, there were the Fleischer brothers, and before the Fleischer brothers, there was Winsor Mccay and other central people, but these are the big ones. And I think about Winsor Mccay as he's working in the teens, and before him there are some European animators too, but Winsor Mccay begins with, he does cartoons like Gertie the Dinosaur, which is about showing you what a dinosaur might look like and to see how it might move. And then he turns to more serious things like the sinking of the Lusitania, where he actually wants to document what happened in this disaster where the Lusitania was sunk by German U-boats. And that shift is one where he actually wants to treat animation as a way of producing a document that couldn't otherwise be produced because everything was destroyed.
You couldn't see, yes. Okay.
Right. So right there is that idea of making visible something that you couldn't see otherwise. And then from there, we move into more entertainment-centric kinds of animation like the Fleischers and Disney and Warner Brothers. And then UPA, the studio that I focus on, United Productions of America, circles back to recapturing that communicative impulse in animation.
So the UPA, my understanding is those were a number of artists that worked with Disney, and then after a strike in 1941, they end up in a different collection. Is that correct?
They did leave during the strike along with many other people. It broke down along lines of union membership. Disney was a union buster, and a lot of people went on strike and then quit. But it also has a bit of an artistic origin too, which is that a lot of the animators at Disney, especially during the Depression when it was hard to find work in art, ended up doing animation work for Disney because they could paint, they could draw. But they'd been trained in modernist art, in experimental art, and so that was where their hearts really were. And so on the one hand, there's dissatisfaction at Disney because of pay scales and bonuses and things like that. But there's also a kind of artistic impulse where they wanted to do something different.
Because they also had to do what somebody else had the vision, they did this, you may paint the cells and do the background, but you're not actually the creator. So, I imagine there's some tension there.
For sure. Disney Studio was very hierarchically organized in general.
Still is.
And still is, yeah. But Disney also, you're right, it was his vision, and that vision is the illusion of life, and it's about taking animation closer and closer to cinema, to live action film with depth and camera movements and making
and all the characters would move almost like even if they were animals, they would move like they were human, and the leaves in the trees would blow, and you'd have a depth of perception and all of that. Okay.
Yeah.
And so this is a response to that, a creative response to that, or?
Yeah, think about the way modern art says we're not so interested in doing pictorial landscapes anymore. We want to deal in abstract form. And there's a similar kind of movement in animation with these artists who end up at UPA that, yes, they want to be making cartoons in Hollywood, but they want to move away from the idea that animation should, as a kind of destiny, move toward looking real, looking like
more
live action film. Yeah, they wanted to do something more graphic and more modernist with it.
And when we're talking about a means of communication, of its ability to share information or to persuade us, why would one form be more preferable, or in what context would one form be more preferable than the other?
Well, I think the most useful context that we can think about this in is UPA's beginning work, not in movie theaters, but in Army training films. That was where they first got their start, and they never even imagined they'd be doing entertainment films. And they, two of the lead animators at UPA, Zach Schwartz and John Hubley, wrote a kind of manifesto for their style of animation. It's called Animation Learns a New Language. And their entire point here is that animation is a special medium, and it's able to communicate in a way that no other kind of visualization can. And in a way, it's a merger of the diagram and the photographic film, or the photograph. A photograph can show us the outside of something, and so can a film, a live action film. And it can show us what our eyes could already see. A diagram can show us what's happening under the surface, what's happening inside, but a diagram doesn't move, so it can't show you a process in motion.
Okay.
So animation can show you the interior aspect of something or the invisible aspects of something, but it can show a process unfolding too. And so that's
It could also show its essence. I mean,
Yes.
because the diagram or the drawing, I mean, the pen can jump across the table, even though it can't do that, but a cartoonist could draw it that way.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. It can show you, it can distill a complex process into something
Yes.
you can see.
Okay.
So some of their earliest films are showing what happens inside the body when you get scared.
Yes, ever since the world began, men have been scared. The brave knights of old had those same cold beads of perspiration. Their hair stood on end. Their hands got clammy.
And this was shown to Army recruits to prepare them for battle. What happens, what inflation is. And so they were able to use abstract form and show, stacks of dollar bills running into a bank and then running out of it. And so that specific dimension of animation, of moving drawings, was important to them.
So I wonder, Disney seemed originally for children, and the idea that it was more real made it, more enjoyable, I guess? But if you're talking about recruits to the Army, or even now when I think about Hanna-Barbera or the Adult Swim on television, for the adults, there seems less of a concern about the richness, the background, the color. Because we're adults, we know it's a cartoon, so we don't need all that. Let's get straight to like a political cartoon or a comic strip. I wonder if there's any relation between those two and why one art form as animation was directed more towards children or young adults versus the documentaries and animation that's simpler in its style.
Yeah, I do think this is another part of UPA's kind of foundational charter as their opening rules when they started was no talking animals, no violent humor. And so this was a kind of broadside against both Disney and Warner Brothers.
Yes.
That they wanted to do something different. One of their theatrical cartoons is an adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. Nothing funny whatsoever about it. It's really disturbing. And I'm imagining movie theater audiences sitting down in the movie thinking, what are we going to see tonight? Is it going to be bugs? And instead they get Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. They wanted to adapt James Thurber, and so they were doing highbrow is maybe the wrong term, because they had a great sense of fun,
New York.
too.
I think of New Yorker.
Yeah.
Or for that matter, I think of Alley Oop and some of the other strips that were in newspapers, which were largely read by adults, not children. And those didn't have background, didn't have color. They were very sparse. So
Yeah.
it seemed like there's already a cultural acceptance or an interest.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's, on the one hand, a sensibility of we want to capture what it's like to be living today. So it's modern stories as opposed to Disney's kind of fairy tales.
Yes.
And that simplified style is a way of capturing something larger that's happening in American culture at the moment, which is modern design, which is becoming really big in the post-war era for a whole
We're
host
talking
of
1950s
reasons.
Mad Men type thing.
The Mad Men type thing.
Architecture, what do they call mid-century furniture now that
Yep.
tends to be sleek and stylish and clean lines. So you're suggesting that the animation is kind of a reflection of that general cultural movement?
Yeah, think how you're describing this, about simplified forms, about stark, pared down shapes and bright colors, and that removal of ornate detail and decoration. That's what UPA is doing with animation, and it's also what architecture and design are doing in the period for a whole host of reasons. And the one thing I would maybe push back on is, rather than calling it the animation a reflection of these other forms, I think they're all working together to, in a way, retrain the way that people see, and to use animated form or architectural or design form to help people see differently and to help them see more clearly. There's a kind of utopian impulse to retrain human vision that's going on with all of these art forms.
Well, that's their intent, but one might argue that every era, every zeitgeist is trying to have a particular way of seeing the world. So to say we see it better, I can accept your argument. On the other hand, someone might say, well, no, that's a loss. This is the way to see it better. But it certainly captures or reflects, and I wouldn't want to privilege one or the other, but there's a general era of this simple, get to the direct, make the sale even, get to the point, and the animation is reflecting that, contributing to that as well?
Yeah, I think I would absolutely say that. And in terms of the idea of simplifying and making things more easily digestible, there's a lot of writing in terms of design theorists and architects and artists at the time about how as the world is becoming more and more complex, and this is a very deeply felt post-war feeling, that one way to get a grasp on all this complexity is to use artistic form to simplify it and to try to give a sense of order, give a sense of intelligibility to a world that seems like it's spinning faster and faster and moving more out of control.
Yeah. It seems to me there may be some political ramification of that too, because when the world is complex, out of control, it's outside of my understanding. If somebody can capture this, again, in a political cartoon or a simple, sparse animated feature, that's going to be more powerful than a whole storyline with multiple characters and lots of background. You know, I may go in a theater for that, but it's not going to be the same as watching Mr. Magoo, which was one of UPA's first most popular, is that right?
Yeah, he's one of their earliest characters. The one that really makes it big before that is Gerald McBoing-Boing. He wins UPA their first Academy Award.
Isn't that back now? Isn't there a Boing-Boing now?
He's come back a few times.
Okay.
To my mind, never as wonderfully as he was in the original cartoons. But there's something really endearing about this small boy who, when he tries to speak, only sound effects come out, and they're pointedly technological sound effects. And so there's a way to even read this simple cartoon. It's narrated by Dr. Seuss. It has a very childlike feel. But the essence of the character is somebody who just seems addled by modernity, by all of this technology, and it's making him unable to communicate. And so even within their seemingly entertainment-based and silly theatrical cartoons, there's still that impulse to deal with communication.
There's still an underlying message, an underlying ideology. It would seem like Boing Boing would have a comeback now when there's the fear of artificial intelligence and everything is with your Alexa or your phone. I don't have to talk, I simply have to make a few sounds that will get this out.
Oh, man. Gerald McBoing-Boing for the internet age would be a really compelling cartoon.
In addition to your research, you could do a creative piece.
Oh, yeah. There is, you're right though, a strong political bent to UPA too. They begin with government contracts. They do a campaign film for FDR's reelection.
For the UAW. So they were linked with labor. Also,
were.
It's interesting that they came out of a labor strike. These were the people that Disney pushed out, and one of their first or second contracts was with the UAW to promote UAW politics, I guess?
And I mean, with FDR, there's a kind of, this is the moment to have those politics. And so one of the earliest films they did is called Brotherhood for Man, and it's about racial harmony. And this is also sponsored by the UAW. And they use that simplified form to, for instance, they take the outlines of typical houses of various cultures and kind of sandwich them together. And the point you get from seeing this is, the frills might look different and the basic, or the outlines might be a little disjointed, but the basic structure of these houses is the same. And then from there, it builds a larger metaphor about how we're all human underneath. And then once the Cold War sets in, those kind of left-leaning politics make them unfit for government work. And so that's when they turn to the theatrical market.
Okay. I guess I should have said the UAW, the United Auto Workers, because I want to make sure that we give due recognition to labor, because that's one of the sources of the UPA. I have a slightly different question, and we can come back to the aesthetic or animation as a creative means of communication. I know that anime in Japan, which has become an art form on its own, but when it originally started, its primary impulse was they were also in a war, and they didn't have the funds to do all of the animation. They couldn't do the background like Disney. They couldn't do color. So it became a very almost cut and paste, right? The characters would move across the background would move, the character wouldn't, and they would put little lines above their heads. So, but that was all prompted for economic reasons.
Right.
So I wonder, Hanna-Barbera, which comes after UPA or UPA, in addition to the aesthetic, was there an economic impulse for this to make it? Because obviously, if I do my little picture here of a face and a man, I'm done, as opposed to a 3-day-long project of getting the angles right. So was there some economic impulse for the UPA and modernist animation?
For sure, there was an economic impulse. I mean, think about how they get their start with government contracts, which are much less lavishly funded than a Hollywood studio budget that someone like Disney is working with.
See the sergeant, I don't want color, I just want my troops.
Yeah. And even when Disney does work for the U.S. government, he has trouble fitting their limited budgets because it's just not a movie studio, you know? So there is a big economic impulse for what's referred to as limited animation, which is what UPA develops, where they draw fewer frames of film for each second of film. So normally there'd be 24 frames for a second of film, that's what cinema is, but they would draw 12 instead.
Yes, so it's more, we would see it, the viewer would see it as a little bit more jerky.
Right, and you know,
not as fluid.
I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah, they would only redraw parts of the frame. This is why when you're watching something like Rocky and Bullwinkle, only their mouths are moving, but everything else is perfectly still. It's a cheaper way to do animation, and they had to do that on government budgets. That's half the story, I think. And then the other half is that the desire to have this pared down graphic style predates their opportunity to forge it in these government contracts and then in their theatrical work.
Explain that again.
Sure, sorry.
No, that's all right. The animation as a creative style predates the economic benefit to the company or to the client.
Yeah, even when these animators are working at Disney and they have the budget, they're still thinking, we'd really love to do something more graphic. Yeah. And so it's part determined by money, and then the other part is a moment where they're realizing, okay, if we have to work on these low budgets, we can, I hate to say turn these lemons into lemonade because it wasn't unpleasant for them, but we can also now have a chance to experiment with our graphic ideas, and these two things can work together.
What will become of that style? I mean, UPA is not UPA anymore, but we do have Hanna-Barbera, right, still. Yogi Bear, Rocky, Bullwinkle are gone, but we still have others. And we also have Adult Swim, which isn't exactly that, but it's certainly more sparse than a Disney.
Yeah.
I just wonder what happens as we move to a digital age where will there still be this interest in doing the sparseness, the animation that is what, simplistic, direct, abstract?
God, I hope so. I mean, we'll always have Pixar, right? And they're carrying on that Disney legacy. But I think about, you mentioned Hanna-Barbera, and there's a kind of fall from grace narrative where UPA is doing this for art. And MoMA gives them an exhibit in 1955, and they're written up in all kinds of highbrow magazines. And this style is viewed as being artful before anything else. And then Hanna-Barbera becomes the studio that cheapens that style for the sake of TV budgets. And so they have a kind of, I think, unfairly poor reputation for that. I think there's a lot more going on with Hanna-Barbera. And so I think we can still see...
Well, they were driven by the market. They're interested in building the market, so it may couch or curtail your artistic impulse because we don't need it, or we can't have it, or the client won't buy it, or the viewers won't. I don't know.
And I can't deny it. I mean, there is something lacking in Hanna-Barbera's cartoons that UPA had. I mean, I think you really see economic determination in Hanna-Barbera's cartoons. They just had to move cheap and fast. Yeah. But I do think we can still see glimmers today of returns to simplified hand-drawn animation to a more kind of flat graphic aesthetic. It may not have the same kind of distribution and reach as a Pixar film does, but I think around the margins there are still that kind of graphic animation style circulating.
If we take some of the functions of media or communication from information and persuasion and socialization and entertainment, how does this style of animation incorporate each of those? You're already saying the documentaries were effective with the troops, But what's the relationship between this? Because you're talking about it being artistic. So in that sense, it brings us pleasure, it's entertaining, but it's also at the same time effectively communicating ideas. What's the interaction, I guess, between the creative style and its effectiveness as a communication medium?
I think, if I think about the cartoons that UPA did, I think one of the main ways in which they're able to communicate powerfully is their explicit embrace of the realities of everyday life. And so they're able to show, in a sense, kind of ordinary people, or quirky ordinary people. You know, Gerald McBoing-Boing he can't speak, but he lives in a suburban home, you know? So these cartoons are able to connect with the lived everyday experience of average Americans in a way that maybe a kind of fairy tale in a nameless kingdom can't quite do.
Artistically, because there's no extraneous overlay or accoutrements, whatever. I mean, it's just, this is it?
Yeah, and also think about the furniture and the design that you were talking about in this period. This is what people in America are seeing as what's called good design, as what's contemporary, what's current, what's the kind of proper right way to decorate your home, and what the most current and up-and-coming architecture looks like. And all of these things are very closely tied to notions of what it means to be a good citizen, that you're buying the right things, and you're supporting an economy that's a capitalist economy that's therefore not communist, and so we're not like them. And all of these elements of good design are part of a consumer market that is very deeply tied to persuading Americans that capitalism, persuading the world really, that capitalism is the way to go, and this is the kind of economy that gives you all of these wonderful, beautiful modern things, whether it's animation style or furniture style or architecture.
It just seems ironic that the people that John Hubley you talked about and others that are leaving Disney for this creative freedom are yet part of a larger culture that's moving towards consumerism, and everything is commodified. And I mean, were they aware of that? Were they resisting that? It's kind of like the dilemma every artist has. To what extent am I expressing art and the human condition, and to what extent am I trying to get my stuff hung in a gallery so I can make lots of money? It's like...
Hubley's an interesting case. He was the creative director there, and the one who had the most enduring, I think, personal creative legacy afterward. He got blacklisted. He was hauled before the House Un-American Activities Committee.
He gets pushed. He's no longer no longer a leader or a central figure here.
Yeah, he was suspected of communism, and so he was drummed out of Hollywood. And so there is an interesting tension between the left-leaning politics of the animators at this studio and the way that they get enfolded into a kind of consumerist, the world that they're circulating in when they enter theatrical cartoons with Columbia, a major industrial studio. So I think that's part of the complexity that you're right, we have to deal with every kind of art, and especially in a big industrial art like film that requires so many people involved.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, it would seem that animation style would have appeal because there's less of a need to have that kind of budget, that kind of resource, even that kind of participation. I want to close with a question that may go beyond your book, or if I get the book, maybe it's in the conclusion, but it strikes me that there's something, almost a universal insight here that you're providing us, is that you talked about animation, you talked about architecture, I talked about furniture, we could talk about, television, the whole culture of the 50s, anti-communism. The suggestion is that the art of the era and the entertainment of the era is part of that's the era. So I wonder if you would be able to say anything about the era that we live in now. I mean, I know we can't predict, but can we say something? You mentioned Pixar, and we talk about special effects, and is that the same way animation's reflecting the 50s? Is the spectacle and the overdone, what? the Pixar special effects, is that a reflection of the culture and the attempt of creating a culture that we now live in? Perhaps.
I think if we can kind of draw a parallel between the period that I write about, there's UPA as a force, but there's also Disney in his kind of his illusion of life realist style. And I think today we have Pixar that's doing that kind of realist work. But I mean, think about television animation. You've talked about Adult Swim, thinking about shows like Bob's Burgers, and even the legacy of The Simpsons that's still going. I think these two things always run on parallel tracks, and we have a kind of maximalist aesthetic like Pixar, but there's also these kind of odd, off-kilter, weird, stylized things on the side, and they speak just as much to today's culture about weirdness and misfits and not quite having that lush Pixar ability.
Unfortunately, we can't have a lush conversation either because we're at the end of our time. Maybe we can have you back, or after the book is published, we can talk some more, and I will continue to pursue that question of the relationship between something like animation, which is a means of communication, but also an art form, and how it reflects the culture we live in. But that's all the time we have on our program. Thank you, Dr. Dan Bashara.
Thank you for having me here.
For joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.